Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm Greer and it's lovely to have you here with me today. It's been a while. I have not posted in quite a few weeks at this point. I've been going through some changes in my personal life, and I've also just needed to take some time to regroup, to think about the kinds of content that I want to post on this channel moving forward, and to think also about how I can post more consistently. But if you've clicked on this video, you're still here. Thank you so much for being here. So I thought we'd ease back into things with a bit of a chit chat on some of the content that I've been enjoying over the past couple weeks, because why not? There's a book, a newsletter, a podcast episode, as well as an article and a short film, all of which I found really inspiring in their own ways. Hopefully you will come away with some good recommendations for things to check out in your own time. But let's just get into the video, and I wanted to start by talking about a book called How We Show Up by Mia Birdsong. So I remember a couple months ago I was listening to The Atlantic's podcast How to Talk to People. The episode I was listening to is called How to Not Go It Alone, and the guest for that episode was Mia Birdsong. She is a Black family activist and author. I remember the conversation revolving around community and the fact that in many cultures, the family is a self-sufficient unit. So essentially it's normal and expected that you ask for help, whether you need childcare or you need someone to, do your hair for you, you need a haircut, or you need someone to lend you some cash until, payday. And it's not expected that you should feel like a burden because you're asking for help. In that episode, she also talked about the fact that, during the pandemic, we sort of saw this slowing down of the wheel of capitalism. We were seeking out community more and more. Some of us moved back home to be closer to family and friends. And some people went into a very deep depression because of that overwhelming sense of loneliness. So naturally, I became curious about Birdsong and her body of work. So I looked her up and I discovered that she had published this book, How We Show Up. In How We Show Up, she chronicles through personal experiences as well as experience with others, the way that people are starting to redefine the family structure, as well as what it looks like to resist things like toxic individualism and opt to instead lean on each other more. A lot of the content is focused on what happens in American societies. I am not American, but I did spend some time living in the US, and I did see a lot of those dynamics play out. Things like the toxic individualism, where you think that if you can't do it on your own, then you're not good enough, you're not capable enough, you're not deserving of the American dream. She talks about the ways in which capitalism creates a barrier to self-awareness, the way it seeps into things like self-care. We're taught to believe that in order to take care of ourselves, we have to spend money, we have to go on these luxury trips and buy these fancy things. And like I mentioned, a huge part of what's discussed in this book is the way that people are redefining partnership, redefining family, what it means to, be in community with others. It questions why we put so much weight on traditional institutions like marriage. Why are there thousands of federal laws in places like the US that only benefit people who have decided to enter this traditional institution of marriage? Why is it that we use the term significant when we say significant other to describe only someone who we are romantically or sexually involved with? Why is it that we still look at the nuclear family as sort of the gold standard of the family structure? There are a lot of stories in here from real people who have experimented with different family structures and partnerships. For example, friends who decide to live together and raise children. It goes back to this whole idea of queering what it means to be in community with each other. So if you're looking for a really timely and relevant nonfiction read, I'd highly recommend How We Show Up. So I actually didn't realize that it is National Poetry Month. It turns out that this next recommendation is quite timely. Now, I'm somebody who has always enjoyed reading poetry. It's such a good way to slow down. It's funny because I remember in primary school, we used to have to memorize and then recite poems for our exams. And then in high school, I remember for our regional exams, we used to have to memorize like something like 20 poems and just know them, so that the ones that appeared on the exam, we were able to answer questions about them. So that was a bit stressful, but even so, I think, being exposed to poetry from those early years is what has helped me to develop my appreciation for it. I came across this publication called Read a Little Poetry. It's been around since 2005, and it is run by a Filipina poet. I think her name is T. de los Reyes. It's essentially a way to discover poetry. It is a collection of poems that the author has shared, not her own poems, but by other poets. If you go to the website, you'll see that there are a number of different ways you can discover poetry. There's a blog called Notebook where you can see the author's marginalia, and I think it's always fascinating to be able to see people's interaction with a work. You can also discover poems based on themes or poets, and there's also another interesting discovery tactic where you can see the first lines and last lines of different poems, and you can click in and read based on that. And so I found that really interesting as well. Overall, I think this is such a beautiful documentation of an enduring love for poetry. If you're into poetry at all, or you're looking to get into poetry, then I'd highly recommend checking out Read a Little Poetry. So I just talked about the way that reading poems helps me to slow down, and this next recommendation also has to do with the concept of time and slowing down. So there's this podcast called Time Sensitive that I recently started listening to. So Time Sensitive is a long-form interview-style podcast, and it examines the life and work of each of its guests through the lens of time. So the episode that I was listening to that I found really thought-provoking was one that featured American museum curator Helen Molesworth and her concept of museum time. I love a good museum trip. Museums also help me to slow down, to get into that mode of just observation and sort of silent interaction with works of art. One of my favorite museums is the Leopold in Austria, particularly because that is the first time I saw the work of Egon Schiele. Anyway, that's a whole other conversation. Molesworth talks about museums as institutions of enlightenment, and I just wanted to share a quote with you. You don't go to a museum the way you go to a Marvel movie. You go to a museum to be shattered, to be rendered asunder, to be transformed. So before we get into what exactly museum time is, one of the things that Molesworth talks about is this idea that laziness and slowness and idleness, we often villainize these states of being. We live in a culture of speed where, our self-worth or our value is often determined by how much we can get done. Molesworth makes the point that laziness and idleness and slowness are essentially anti-capitalist forms of resistance. They are in direct opposition to these systems that force us to sell our time, right? And so this is where the idea of museum time comes in, because Molesworth says that one of the main roles of museums in our society today is to be slow, right? To help us to slow down in a culture that has lost its mind on speed. But even if you're not somebody who particularly enjoys a specific type of art, or will stand in front of a painting and ponder on the artist's intentions, I think just the slowness and the act of observation and this sense of reverence that museums tend to stir up inside. Maybe reverence isn't the right term, but I feel like you probably get what I mean. Again, I think it's important to remember that states of laziness and idleness can indeed be valuable in moderation. So one of the publications that I follow is called Psyche, and I was going through it recently and I came across this short film called Rosemary A.D. based on the true story of a man who is contemplating taking his own life, and one of the only things that is stopping him is the thought of what his newborn daughter's life is going to be like without him. It's a very grotesque and candid exploration of all of the ways that his daughter's life could perhaps turn out if he wasn't there to see it. What I think makes this really poignant is the way that the story is told, the medium through which it's told. It's a series of stop motion, crayon drawn illustrations accompanied by his voiceover and sound effects, all of which he did on his own. If you know anything about, stop motion films, you know how much effort that requires. And then on top of that, doing your own voiceover and doing the sound effects. There's also a mini documentary on YouTube that is sort of a behind the scenes of his process, and I'd also recommend checking that out if you're interested. It's just really cool to see the person behind this story and to go through that process with him. So overall, I think it's very valuable commentary on fatherhood and depression and what it's like when those two things exist at the same time. It's a really moving and impressive piece of work. Of course, it deals with a very sensitive topic, but I just think it's so real and raw and definitely worth a watch. So the final piece of content that I want to talk about is an article in a publication called Atom. It's a piece called Being Human. This piece explores our interconnectedness with the universe and emphasizes that contrary to the way that we act,
it's the way you act.
Contrary to the way that we operate, we are not separate from the natural environments that we exist in. It explores at a scientific level what makes us up, what makes up the human microbiome, from bacteria to viruses to fungi. But it is not just that. I think it is also in many ways meant to be a wake-up call. It invites us to consider not only the awe that we should feel at our own existence and the sheer profundity of that, but also encourages us to think about how important it is for us to protect that. It later leads into addressing the war on Palestine and the toll that war is taking on the human and global microbiome. And so I'll quote directly from it here. Every one of us is a zoo in our own right, a colony enclosed within a single body, a multi-species collective, an entire world. And so it is worlds we are talking about when we see statistics like the thousands of Palestinians who have been killed by the Israeli bombardment on Gaza. What's more is that 40% of deaths in Gaza are reported to be children, realms freshly formed. Every life is a planet lost, a failure of the international community, our global microbiome, to protect the very fabric of our own by standing united for a permanent ceasefire. If you're interested in reading something that will truly help to bring things back into perspective and bring your existence back into perspective, then I do recommend giving this a read. So that wraps up the list of favorites that I wanted to share with you today. Of course, I'm going to have links to everything down in the description if you're interested in checking any of it out. If you enjoyed this video, remember to leave a like and subscribe. Comment and let me know if you are interested in seeing more videos like this from me. I really enjoy doing these and sharing this type of content with you, just because reading articles and newsletters and listening to podcasts and general knowledge gathering is such a huge part of my life at the moment. So naturally, it's something that I want to share. So if you're interested in more videos like this, do let me know down in the comment section, and also let me know what you have been either reading or watching or listening to lately. Of course, I'm always happy to hear from you down in the comment section. So with that, take good care, and I'll see you in the next video, which hopefully isn't too far away. Bye.